Do you think that the party would have acquiesced to the centralization of authority under Xi in recent years had it not been for the disorder and perceived infighting triggered by the Xilai incident and also the Li Jihua incident, which followed right after it?
Yes, I do. And the reason I say that is because at the time in 2012, the scandals that we knew about that blew up in our faces were the fall of Xilai and the later in 2012, not the immediate downfall of Ling Jihua, Hu Jintao's lieutenant in power, but the scandal around his family and in particular his son. So that was later in 2012. I forget which month. Was it August? You better check your calendars on that. But anyway, again, one of these stories that breaks out in rumors and then dribs and drabs of information. But Ling Jihua's son is involved in this crash on the outskirts of Beijing involving an extremely expensive sports car in which, if the stories that are believed, he was in the car with a young woman. Both of them are sort of thrown out of the car, but there's this extraordinary scene of wreckage around there. I think there was a death involved as well. So that begins to crack open another seam of the corruption that had been growing in the Chinese political elite around then. Now, what we didn't know about around back then, but what becomes clear essentially is that this corruption is also eating at other institutions in China and eating very deeply. So it's after Xi Jinping comes to power that there's these extraordinary investigations that take place into the military leadership, into state security, into the arms of power that are really the sinews of Communist Party control. I think it's pretty clear that even without the Xilai scandal and Ling Jihua scandal, leaders like Xi Jinping knew in a general sense what was happening in these institutions. They were being rotted from within by corruption and cronyism, and so that there was a general sense that something had to be done about it. I think what the Xilai and Ling Jihua scandals did is to add public impetus to that program and to demonstrate to the Chinese public more widely about just how serious corruption was becoming, why something needed to be done about it. We can talk about the specifics of the charges against Xilai and his family, but it's certainly true that in the scale of corruption, as it's emerged in subsequent cases, it wasn't anywhere near one of the most serious cases of corruption in terms of the amount of money that was involved in the indictment.
Do you think that those who cooperated with Xi and others in bringing Bo down now regret it?
It's a tricky question to answer, especially now I have to confess I'm not in China, haven't been in China for a couple of years now. So, talking to people about their regrets is a bit more difficult than before. I would say this. I think it's important to remember that when Xi Jinping came to power, he came to power born by a lot of hopes that he was going to help clean up China, and that there'd been this accumulation of unresolved issues in China, latent crises that cried out to be dealt with. And I remember late 2012 going to this sort of meeting in Beijing immediately after the party congress when Xi Jinping is installed as party leader. And there's sort of these retired reformist officials and intellectuals and going around this circle of people, each of them giving these short speeches about their expectations of the new leadership and what they wanted. And not everybody, but certainly generally the air even in a meeting like that was one of hope for Xi Jinping, and hope in particular that he would prove to be a leader who was willing to solve these problems, but at least incrementally also to push forward the process of political and cultural liberalization in China. And although there were certainly people back then who thought Xi Jinping was going to be a very different, harder line leader, I think back then, even in informed circles in Beijing, those voices were probably the minority. And quite a lot of people invested their hopes that Xi Jinping was going to be if not a reformer, then a relatively moderate leader. Of course, it didn't take very long for those hopes to be dispelled and for Xi Jinping to emerge as a very different leader. Now, having said that, finally getting to your question, uh, I think certainly in the first few years of Xi Jinping's time in power, I would say it's probably fair to say there was a lot of ambivalence among people in China, even among officials, about the direction of the anti-corruption campaign. On the one hand, it was a danger to people because corruption and grey income had become such an important source of wealth generation for Chinese officials. It was very easily for anybody to be accused of corruption and for a case to be built against any particular official that they were corrupt. So I think that counted to develop, that helped to develop this sense of fear that everybody is vulnerable to this new leader who's willing to, at least at some level, begin to take down officials who are involved in this kind of bribe taking and helping your friends with business deals and so on. At the same time, I mentioned the ambivalence. I do think there was also this sort of appreciation, even among people who'd been benefiting from that corrupted system, that something had to change. This sense that, yeah, it's been good for me personally and my family's been doing well, but my goodness, it's not good for the country as a whole, and something has to be done. So I think, there's this sort of sense of ambivalence, and I think that persisted. So when you ask whether people have regrets, they may well have regrets at this point in Xi Jinping's term in power. But certainly think, I think in those early years, there was still this sense that, yeah, well, you know, he was getting out of control and something had to be done about it. And, my income may be down and I'll have to pull my head in, but yeah, we understood that a new leader was going to deal with this anyway.